Part 1. Fog and Footnotes. The rain had finished by morning, but the city wore its damp like a rumor that won't quite wash away. London, I've learned, keeps a weathered diary of its failures in every gutter and guttering street lamp. The newsroom at Gresham House, with its windows pale as peeled lemon, smelled faintly of coal dust, damp wool, and the stubborn tang of tea that never quite cools. I was supposed to file a routine update on the river trade and the new timetables for the steam ferries when the day handed me a fragment that didn't fit any ordinary column. The knock came at 9, the sort of knock that sounds polite on the outside and a little desperate on the inside. A constable, cheeks pale, hat brimming with drizzle and a hint of fear, slid a folded note across my blotter with the care of a man delivering bad news in a drawing room. The note bore no seal, only a careful scrawl that looked more like a mechanic's handwriting than a journalist's. A window latch found in a place it ought not to have been. A common object placed where it wouldn't be seen unless someone was looking for it. I unrolled the note and read, for the second time that morning, the sentence that didn't belong to any ledger of city business. A place, a time, a rhythm, a thing that did not belong to the day's headline. The latch was ordinary enough, brass, a touch of tarnish, nothing to frighten a tradesman, but the context did. The latch was found not on a door, but in a gutter near the river's edge, glossed with rain and the city's own refuse. A slip of a thing, almost ceremonial in its plainness, as if someone had laid down a small token to mark a passage through. The first clue flashed into my notes as I read the notice aloud to myself, as one reads aloud to a patient horse to keep both head and heart steady. A body had been found not far from the docks, in a narrow lane that stank of brine and waste, where the canal's breath came through grate and drain. Not a murder in the sense the papers loved, no spray of gore, no theater of fear, but a carefully arranged tableau. The body lay as if posed for a portrait of routine. Hands folded at the chest, shoes aligned with the hem of a damp cloak, a label on the man's coat as though someone had wanted to make clear this was a thing done with precise intention and not with random malice. The difference, to a city hungry for certainties, felt almost cruel. I kept my own breathing even, the way a man does when he's learned to stand still under a bombardment of sirens and gossip. It was not even a death, so much as a maintenance of a pattern the city refused to acknowledge. A victim laid to allude to a clockwork of streets and hours, a mechanism hidden in plain sight. If the newspapers loved a serial killer, they would be disappointed in the manner of truth I offered. A careful, clinical map, not a confession, not a theater. The newsroom's bell clanged as the gas lights hissed and pooled their pale halos over ink-stained desks. Clerks and copy boys moved with the half-terrified efficiency of people who knew the city had a habit of swallowing its own statements and spitting out rumors in exchange for pecuniary comfort and a front-page scream. I kept a ledger in the corner of my mind, not a notebook, but a little metal box where I stored the phrases that might bite, patterns, timings, places where the city's heart beat too quickly or too slowly. The first murder I encountered in the old calibrations of this city had been an accident of history, an event that arrived with the steam and then departed with little more than a whisper. But these new tableaux were not accidents. They were edits. The city's script was being rewritten with a pen that knew the shape of fog and the weight of a boot in a hallway. The killer moved not with brute force, but with a surgeon's insistence on precision, as if the city itself could be tuned like a clock to reveal a secret if one only listened. I stepped onto the street beneath a vault of damp cloud, where the sky wore ash and the soot from 10,000 chimneys hung like a pall over the river. The air tasted faintly of coal, iron, and something else, something mineral and old, the taste of a city that has learned to swallow its own history and swallow it again. The Thames was a broad, reluctant artery tonight, carrying away the day's laundry and leaving behind its own ragged breath. By mid-morning, the city had begun to speak in two voices: the official voice that weighed every syllable with a sense of duty, and the rumor's voice, which thrummed like a wire beneath the cobbles. The latter is never wholly untrue, though it loves a flourish. A nurse with the gentleness of a mother and the fatigue of a woman who has tended too many wounds spoke to me in a patient whisper in a ward where the clock seemed to have stopped at some hour between hope and resignation. She had seen the body. She had seen the hands arranged as if in a vow. She spoke of the little things, the way the killer left a single chosen object with the body, an item of no great value, but placed with a precise purpose, a sequence as if to say, this, then that, then the other. Not random, not reckless, she said, her eyes lowered so that the room's light did not touch her pain directly. A pattern in the city's gears. A man who treats life as a machine and who places pieces where they will teach us to look at what we otherwise overlook. A smart thing to say. And I wrote it down with that careful hand that makes a page look steady even when the mind is racing. The city's gears. Yes. The more one looks, the more one sees how London's machinery was never merely steel and steam. It was human intention, social design, and the invisible economies that run beneath every promenade, alley, and counting house. The killer's work, it seemed, was to pull at those economies and see who would stumble when the clock ran down. I visited the riverbank after lunch, the river's edge where the canal boats rest like sleeping beasts, and the men who work the ferries go home with shoulders bent by a day's labor and a night's fear. The latch in the gutter felt suddenly less like an oddity and more like a talisman, something the killer left as a signature, a gesture to the city's most neglected rooms. The back doors of workhouses, the stairwells of the markets, the damp corridors of lodging houses forgotten by respectable maps. In a leather-bound notebook, I sketched a crude map of the city's moving parts, the river's curve, the dock's tangle, the dark arcs of stairways in tenements. The goal was not to trap a man in a single scene, but to illuminate the rhythm that allowed him to choose time and place with the cold patience of a clockmaker. The more I mapped, the more the city revealed its own hidden clockwork, the telegraph lines that buzzed like a nervous system, the rail yards that trembled with every arrival and departure, the workhouses whose lights burned late into the evening as if to remind the world that some of us live for the morning and some for the night. The first interlude, an inserted diary fragment, lunged from a different throat, a clerk's voice overshadowing mine for a breath. It read in its own spare, careful way. April 12th. The city woke again to a thing that fitted no pattern but was clearly made to be read as one. I stood at the door of the counting house while the rain sank into the stone and thought of all the small violences we pass in a day. Shouted orders, a loan denied, a child's cry muffled by the noise of a cart. Then I saw the latch again, this time in a corner shop window's reflection, as though the city itself held its breath to watch us pretend not to notice. I closed my book and pretended to forget, but the memory would not be quiet. The interlude reminded me why I kept these fragments. The city's memory is uneven, and to tell the truth well, one must bend the memory without breaking it. To publish well is to know which pieces to reveal and which to shade, to let readers fill in a few gaps with their own fear and their own hope. Evening brought its own quiet arithmetic. A policeman with the look of someone who has measured every street corner and every lull between sirens offered me the routine assurance that the police would manage this unseen menace. I asked him what the pattern was, and he gave me a shrug that wasn't a refusal so much as a confession of limited sight. "We have the methods, sir," he said, tapping the papers on his desk as if the weight of the city hung there. "We just lack the eye to see what the eye is blind to. The killer moves where we don't look because we are busy looking where we think trouble ought to be." That sentiment, spoken with the gravity of a confession, sat with me at my desk long after the lamp had drawn its circle of yellow light across the blotter. If fear were a currency, London was rich beyond measure tonight. If truth were a commodity, we had only a handful to barter with, and everyone wanted more than their share. I wrote and rewrote the lead, each version a little more careful than the last, each one a possible door through which the city might walk out of its own fog. The day's last scene came with the city's breath turning colder, and the river's edge growing sharper in the gaslight. A dock worker, his arms smeared with coal dust, spoke in a voice that sounded like the bottom of a bottle, both tired and stubborn. He had seen the first body carried away by a constable's hand and had watched the second and third appear with a strange ritualism. An arrangement of the body and then a single object left near the scene as if a shopkeeper had forgotten to clear a shelf. "What do you think it is?" I asked, though I knew better than to expect a clear answer from a man who sells his labor hour by hour and then is asked to weigh a city's conscience at the end of the day. "Pattern," he said, and spat into the rain-slick gutter. "Not a man who hates men, not a man who loves them either. A man who wants us to see something we don't want to admit we've overlooked." That night, I stood again by the river, the fog lifting timidly, as if the city's breath preferred to speak in whispers rather than shouts. The river knew what London's streets would never admit, that progress exacts a tax, that what we build to comfort ourselves often houses the fears we refuse to name. The killer's method. There was no glamour in it, only a grim sense of timing and a patience that could have been learned from any clockmaker who understands that every second is one more chance to be seen or unseen. And so my own voice, which has learned to be tidy and precise, grew heavy with the weight of questions that do not yield to headlines. If this city is a machine, then murder is its misaligned gear, and the question is not who turns it, but how many eyes fail to notice the cog that doesn't fit. I closed the notebook and walked into the damp air, where the lamps threw halos on the mist, and the street's memory pressed close, insisting I remember what I have seen not as spectacle, but as signal. The city slept late that night, and I slept only to dream of gears turning in the canal's dark water, of a latch glistening in a gutter, of a reader who will one day insist on a truth that is not loud, but true. If I have learned anything in years of chasing stories, it is this. London does not yield its secrets all at once. It reveals them in fragments, in the way a single door handle can tell you more about a man's day than a dozen official reports. And I, stubbornly, will keep listening for those fragments, for the pattern that finally makes sense of the city's fog and of the quiet, patient hand that moves behind it. In the morning, the city will wake again with its customary clamor. Cowrie-scented coffee, the clang of omnibuses, clerks arguing over ledgers, the distant whistle of a steam engine. But the narrative threads will have shifted just enough to propel a new strand into the loom. I will follow that strand, and if I am careful, I will tell a truth that does not sensationalize its shadows, but allows them to breathe. The first act of this particular London, its fog, its iron heartbeat, its insistence on daylight even when the night has not quite learned how to let go, has begun. I am its chronicler, not its savior, and tonight I have learned to listen not only for what the city shouts, but for what it keeps in the hush between sentences. If the killer moves like a clockmaker, then I will write every tick with a steady hand and a wary eye. And perhaps, just perhaps, the city will listen to the clock as well as to the drumbeat of its commerce. And the truth, not loud but true, will rise, heavy with the remedy of time. Part 2. The pattern emerges. The city's breath changes with the seasons, or so a fellow reporter once whispered when the fog hung lower than the hedges of Hyde Park. Tonight, the breath is a loom, weaving thread and shadow through Whitechapel's narrow arteries and along the river's iron edge. I revisit the dockyards not as a witness to commerce alone, but as a cartographer of fear, tracing the lines where work and neglect meet. The second body, found under a corrugated awning near a warehouse that stores more coal than hope, does not scream in the manner the public imagines a killer's work to scream. Instead, the scene is arranged with the same cold pedagogy as the latch in the gutter, hands folded, a cloak drawn, a label pinned with mechanical care. The physiognomy of the moment is not blood and thunder, but geometry, the angles of limbs, the measured space between the body and the nearest waste bin, the precise placement of a single object at the scene's edge. I spend hours with the official report folder, a bundle that weighs more with each redacted paragraph. The city's governors have an instinct for secrecy, a desire to sanitize what is already a sediment of urban fear. A line appears, then disappears, like breath on a glass. Redacted. Observation of patterns suggests a methodical actor exploiting urban vulnerabilities. Pattern. The word prize opened a door in my mind I did not know existed. A city's resilience as a cipher, a population segmented by class, age, and occupation, all marching to different clocks, yet sharing the same hour of vulnerability when the night grows crowded and the lamps dim. I interview a nurse in a hospital ward where the air is thick with ether and unsatisfied prayers. She speaks in the careful cadence of one who has practiced both compassion and distance. She has tended the corpse of the second victim, though she did not know him by name. She says the same thing as the dock worker. A pattern, a sequence. The killer does not strike randomly. He aligns his acts with the city's own routines. The shift changes, the last tram, the closing of the markets, the hour when the canal's basin becomes a quiet stage for the last light to flicker and die. Not a brute, she says, wiping her hands on a stained cloth that smells of antiseptic and rain. A man who understands the city's timetable better than we do. He sets his clock by our routines and then nudges us to notice what we pretend not to see. The stairwell's damp, the back door's latch, the workers' crowded lunch hour where a moment's distraction costs a life. Her voice lowers, as if she's confessing a political crime rather than a personal worry. If you listen, you hear the city telling you where to look. I jot that down with the careful geometry of a man who has learned to be suspicious of poetry in the face of murder. The truth often wears a uniform, not a halo, and the uniform is the city's own design. Police, clerks, matrons, shopkeepers, each playing a part in a drama that is less melodrama and more mechanical. A machine whose gears grind not to produce fear, but to reveal the city's structure. A new witness enters the weave, a constable whose faith in process has been tempered by the brutal arithmetic of a case that refuses to bend to the calendar. He's a man who knows how to count footsteps and how to measure the distance between a body and the nearest street lamp, as if counting the distance between a lie and the truth. He offers me a map drawn on the back of a transit timetable, a crude compass of where to find answers in a city that loves to misplace them. Workhouses, he says, tapping a corner of the map with a finger stained by ink and rain. Markets at dusk, canal basins that gleam with the day's grime, lodgings that bloom like a fungus in the cold. The killer knows these places because they are the city's silent partners in production. He uses them as a ledger. We use the fresh pages to pretend the ledger is clean. He's not wrong. Though I hate to admit he speaks as if the ledger's blemishes could be erased with a sharper headline. I explore the river's edge again, where barges advertise their wares with painted slogans and the men who tend them trade stories for warmth. A widow's letter, smuggled into my pocket by a clerk who longs for a story that might loosen his wife's fear, describes a neighborhood near a canal basin where a single doorway's light remains on late, a beacon visible only to those who know to look for it. The diary fragment I retrieve from a desk in a clerk's cramped office reads in the spare handwriting of a man who counts evenings instead of coins. June 3rd. The city's lamplight does not illuminate truth, but only the space where truth might live. I watched a man sell rags beneath the awning that keeps the doorway dry. He told me a rumor, and I believed him, for rumors have a weight that receipts do not. They travel like pigeons through alleys, stopping to peck at a crumb of certainty before flying to safety in a newspaper's gutter. Tonight I learned that pattern is not only in death, but in mention. The way a name appears in a municipal ledger long after it has ceased to be a person and has become a piece of a machine. If the killer's methods are a cadence, then the city's responses are a counterpoint. The police press the matter with the rigor of a laboratory, collecting fibers and prints, compiling schedules, weighing the risk of exposing a sensitive social web that might unravel if the wrong thread is pulled. The press respond with a mixture of moral outrage and prurient hunger, a chorus that wants both justice and spectacle, the way a child wants both a bedtime story and a scream at the end. The interludes and notes continue as in the narrative above. Text omitted here for brevity in this chat. Part 3. Mask and Mirror. The air grows heavier, as if the fog learned a new trick and decided to refuse to lift at all. The near miss is an event that shakes the newsroom's bones. A shadowed figure, a corridor glare, a moment when a life almost ends because someone looked away at the critical second. The killer, it seems, has learned to walk in the spaces between directives, between policy and principle, between which way the crowd runs and which way the steam engine demands. I follow a thread that leads me to a room in a lodging house where a grieving family has taken the body as a grim ritual. Soap and a shawl, a framed photograph turned to the wall, and a grandmother who speaks in a voice that has learned to be quiet so as not to wake the dead. The daughter's letters, preserved in a battered trunk, offer a rare glimpse into motive not by gore, but by the quiet ache of loss and the sense of a life reduced to a case number. The letters describe a pattern that the killer follows, a personal code that makes the city's vulnerable spaces into stages for a performance only the perpetrator understands as art. The near miss occurs in a market lane crowded with fruit stalls and the smell of citrus, a line of carts, and a constable who, despite years on the force, cannot disguise the tremor in his hands when the killer's silhouette appears at the far end of the alley. It is a moment when the city's clock seems to skip a beat, and for a heartbeat, the journalist's job feels less like reporting and more like survival. I have a moment of ethical reckoning. Should I publish the precise link between the second murder and the Canal Basin District, a pattern that could prevent further deaths, but also brand a neighborhood with shame and panic? The question lands not in the abstract, but on a desk littered with notes, photographs, and the smudged page of a ledger where the dates nest like birds in a spring ash tree. If I publish the link, will I be shaping a social panic that leads to suffocating policies and displaced people? Or will I save lives by forewarning the right audiences? The city's appetite for resolution presses on me, but so does my own code, my obligation to tell truth without exploiting fear or creating a spectacle that profits from tragedy. The diarist within the system, a medical clerk who kept a private log of patient losses, offers a somber counterpoint to the official narrative. In his entries, the killer's pattern appears not as criminal cunning alone, but as a critique of a city that treats its poor as a perpetual source of data and spectacle. The clerk writes, April 27th. The bodies come with a paper trail that others will not read, a line of obituaries that lead nowhere because no one wants to admit how many lives feed the machine. The killer's method is not a murder so much as a commentary. On hunger, on debt, on the way a city's warm rooms stay reserved for the few while the many disappear into the damp stairwells of lodging houses. If justice means fairness, then perhaps justice is the courage to name what is invisible to those who fly the flag of order. Meanwhile, the killer's own voice seems to echo through the city's quiet machines. the telegraph, the waterman's whistle, the factory whistle that never ceases. The pattern is a conductor, not a murderer's song. He is orchestrating the city's attention, and in attention lies power. The power to manipulate fear and to steer public hearts toward a single terrifying idea, that someone is always watching, that the metropolis itself is listening for the right moment to slip into panic. The near-miss scene itself is a poem of restraint. The killer steps from the shadow of a doorway, the public face merely a silhouette against the gaslight, a figure so ordinary in its tour of the city that it becomes terrifying precisely because it blends in. The moment passes and the crowd breathes again, and I am left with a choice, exposure or discretion. The article would be a surgical strike against the killer's anonymity, but at what cost to the people who inhabit the spaces he uses? The ethical calculus becomes heavier than the weight of any ledger. And so part 3 ends not with a revelation, but with a paradox. The more the killer reveals through his method, the less certain the journalist's instrument becomes. The truth, if spoken in its most naked form, might burn the bridges of public trust as readily as it might save lives by preventing harm. I lean into restraint, allowing the pattern to remain a pattern, a city's architecture of fear that demands time, context, and a quiet, unflashy courage to tell the truth without turning it into a staged spectacle. Part 4, the quiet aftermath. The city did not erupt into vigilant mass panic. It settled into a lowered heartbeat, a city that knows danger but chooses evening over hysteria as its default rhythm. The killer's presence, never named with certainty, leaves a fingerprint of unease rather than a corpse-strewn trail. I publish a measured piece that weighs the evidence, acknowledges the pattern, and refuses to sensationalize fear into a currency the city can spend on a nightly headline. This is not a confession of guilt, but a confession of responsibility. To present the facts and the plausible connections between them, to show the social frame in which the murders occurred, the workhouses, the crowded lodging houses, the canal basins, the market lanes, without painting the city as a monochrome stage for a single demon. The crime remains unsettling, but so does the context that makes it possible. The public reaction is a strange mixture of relief and restlessness. People breathe more easily, perhaps, but not deeply. Fear has settled into the city's joints like a familiar ache. The press, caught between sensationalism and sobriety, begins to argue over who owns the narrative's moral instrument. The police, for their part, reassure the public that methods are improving, that more careful coordination between agencies and city wards is forthcoming. Yet the redacted line in the official report persists in memory, a reminder that some knowledge remains a government's privilege and a journalist's burden. In a final diary fragment, found in the bottom drawer of a desk in a newsroom long past quiet, the voice of a young apprentice who witnessed the earlier days of the case offers a quiet, almost lullaby-like contrast to the grim gravity of the other voices. May 15th. The city slept with its eyes open last night, listening for the next notch on the clock. I learned that truth is not a single moment of clarity, but a cadence. Some notes loud, some soft, and most of them held in a breath between two sentences. Our work as reporters is to keep listening, to keep writing what the ear can hear when the street's hum falls away. If we are lucky, the truth we uncover will be enough to nudge the city toward mercy, to remind it that the most dangerous thing is not a killer in the night, but the silence that follows a life ended too soon. Part 4 ends with a cautious resolution. The killer's identity remains technically unresolved, but the pattern's clarity has grown enough to transform journalism's habits and city governance's attitudes. A new set of rules is whispered into the offices. Minor details will be published with care, major connections will be guarded to avoid collateral harm, and the public will be educated to read fear as information rather than raw spectacle. Part 5. Epilogue of glass and fog. Years pass, and the city changes in small ways that feel like almost nothing. A new wing to a hospital here, a refurbished riverbank there, a school building rising where a tenement once stood. The case continues to echo in the newsroom's ritual. The morning paste-up, the black coffee cooling in a chipped cup, the editor's voice insisting on restraint, the junior reporter's eagerness to chase the next sensation. The killer's ghost remains a shadow blending into the fog that forever clings to London's riverfront. A reminder that memory itself is a kind of surveillance, always watching, always listening for the moments when truth might slip into the light. In the long view, I become less the man who chases a single name and more the chronicler who learns to honor the city's complexity. The way a pattern is not merely a list of events, but a map of a society's fear, hope, and the stubborn, unglamorous work of keeping faith with the truth. A final clipping, offered to me by an editor who has long since learned that even the most somber piece needs a lighter touch for the living reader, carries a hint of the future. The city remains a patient, stubborn machine, its heart buried under soot and stone. But journalism, like the river, flows, and in its moving, it remembers. The case is not closed, not in the sense of a tidy ending, but closed enough to show that truth has a shape when we lay it against the city's weathered skin. To tell it is to hold a quiet lantern for those who will walk through fog tomorrow. And I, whose vocation has taught me to listen more than I speak, close this volume with a small confidence that the clockwork of London, the killer's patient, calculating clockwork, will perhaps never be solved completely. But in giving the city back its own story, one that refuses to be sensationalized and insists on context, empathy, and accountability, we grant it a measure of peace. Not closure, perhaps, but something that resembles rest. The sort of rest earned by a city that learns to tell the truth, even when the truth whispers in the dark.